The man with the ledger stands close enough to the pen to feel the heat come off the cattle like a stove door left open. It is early November in the Texas Panhandle, and the morning has teeth. The cold sits down in the low places and will not leave. Breath hangs in pale ropes over the backs of the animals. The mud is thin and slick at the gate, churned to a pudding by hooves and boots, and it has that sour iron smell that comes when earth is bruised too many times in one place. Somewhere off to the side a coffee pot is boiling hard on a coal oil stove, and the wind carries the scent of scorched grounds, sharp as creosote. A man calls numbers, not prayers. Numbers! He calls out lots and waits and bids like he's reading scripture from a page that does not love him back. A pencil scratches. Pages turn. The sound of it is small and mean against the low unrest of thousands of animals packed shoulder to shoulder, all that hide and horn and fear. There are buyers here with clean cuffs and buyers with cuffs darkened by sweat and manure, men with money in their pockets and men with money in their eyes. Some have driven a day, some two, some longer. They've come to watch a giant die without making a noise about it. This is not the romance that gets sold, not the wide shot of a lone rider against a sunrise, not the soft lie of the West where every man is a king and every fence post is a moral statement. This is the end of something that was never quite what it claimed to be. This is an empire being reduced to inventory. They used to say the XIT was bigger than some states. They said it like a boast and like a warning. They said it was a ranch so large a man could ride for days and never find the edge of it. They said it was the purest expression of Texas freedom, open grass and open sky and a brand burned into the side of history. It makes for fine talk. It makes for a fine campfire song. But the truth is that freedom was purchased with contracts and clauses and the soft, careful language of lawyers. The truth is that the ranch began not with a cowboy, but with a government that wanted a monument and did not want to pay cash. The truth is that the West, as it was actually built, did not run on heroism. It ran on acreage, 3 million acres, give or take. A number too big for the mind to hold and too easy for the hand to sign away. Imagine it if you can, not as a map, but as a body. A strip of land along the New Mexico line, a long rib of grass and draw and caprock spread across 10 counties, cut up later into smaller and smaller pieces like meat on a butcher's table. The Panhandle wind is constant out here. It works on a man the way water works on stone. It sands off the pretty parts. It leaves the necessary. The sky is a hard bowl. The horizon is a straight line drawn by someone who never had to live under it. And on days like this one in 1912, the air itself feels like it has been filed down to a blade. The cattle know nothing of capitals and politics. They know feed and water and pressure. They know the push of bodies behind them and the sudden gap at the gate. They move in waves when the men nudge them forward. A hide brushes a sleeve, a horn knocks a rail. The sound is wood on bone, and it carries. There are brands on those hides that mean ownership and debt and a system of order enforced with iron. The brand that mattered most out here was not a family mark handed down in a bloodline. It was a corporate scar. XIT. 3 letters that looked like a warning on the side of an animal, like a sign nailed to the edge of the world. This belongs to someone you will never meet. And now, it is leaving. There is a moment, quiet, almost tender, when a buyer steps forward and touches the flank of a steer the way a man might touch a new saddle. He presses the hide with his thumb, feeling for fat. He squints. He does not look at the horizon. He looks at the animal as a future receipt. A ranch dies not with gunfire, but with men doing math. Somewhere far from this pen in Austin, there is a building of pink granite that catches the light like pride. Men in suits walk its corridors and talk about governance and destiny. They do not smell this mud. They do not hear the lowing. They do not feel the cold that turns your knuckles white. But the building stands because this pen exists. The stone rose because the grass was traded. The dome glows because the Panhandle was parceled out on paper. That is the bargain they do not like to say out loud. They'll tell you the XIT was a symbol, a testament to scale, the ultimate cattle kingdom, a monument to the cowboy. But a kingdom is only as real as the law that defends it, and this one was born in a state house, not in a saddle. It was not just ranching. It was a land and finance machine built to turn public ground into private wealth with the blessing of the state and the patience of distant capital. Was it an act of bold enterprise, the kind that forged the American frontier out of nothing but grit and weather and nerve? Or was it a legal confidence trick, a 3-million-acre conversion where the real product was not beef at all, but land itself? I'm Russ Daniels, and I've been digging through old records and dusty accounts to build toward a steady cadence on stories like this, because I genuinely love ranch country and the people who try to make a life in it. So, if you'll make a pact with me and hit subscribe, I'd appreciate it, and it don't cost a thing. And while you're here, be honest with yourself. Why are you watching? Do you love ranches or something? They say it started with a handshake, a couple of Texas gentlemen and a couple of out-of-state capitalists, squinting into the sun, agreeing to build a capital with nothing but grit and goodwill and a frontier's endless promise. It's a sweet legend. It keeps the blood off the page. But the truth was colder. The truth was a state that wanted a monument and did not have the money for it. The truth was committees and statutes and men who smiled with their mouths while their hands stayed flat on the table, feeling for leverage. Texas did not discover the XIT Ranch the way a man discovers a river. Texas invented it, in ink, in ledger lines, in a decision that said, plainly, we will trade the ground itself for stone. You have to remember what Texas was in the late 1870s. Reconstruction had left scars that did not show in photographs. Railroads were creeping in like wire spiders, and the state's pride was big, but its treasury was not. The old capital, wood and varnish and ambition, had been good enough when the population was smaller and the world did not yet demand spectacle. But by then, Texas was trying to look like a modern power, not a former republic still dressing itself in borrowed clothes. So in 1876, in the new Constitution, there it is, almost casual, like a man setting a pistol on a table. Authorization to use 3 million acres of public land in the Panhandle to pay for a new capital, not cash, not taxes, land. 3 million acres is a number that sounds like weather. You don't picture it, you endure it. It's a slab of country so big it stops behaving like property and starts behaving like a fate. A long, high, wind-worked reach pressed against New Mexico, where the horizon has the blunt honesty of a knife blade. The Panhandle in those years was still spoken of like a rumor, a place of grass and distance, a place you could postpone thinking about, A place that could be counted later, maybe, if anybody ever needed it. In 1879, the legislature does what governments do when they sense a chance to turn uncertainty into a plan. They appropriate the land formally, and they appoint a capital board, top officers of the state, men whose job description is basically this: turn dirt into a building without embarrassing Texas. The board includes the governor and the comptroller and the treasurer and the attorney general and the land commissioner. This is not romance. This is machinery. And then the world, as if impatient with their pace, gives them a shove. On November 9th, 1881, the old Capitol in Austin burns. Accident, they say. A fire that eats varnished wood and paper and whatever else a government keeps close when it thinks history will be kind. A building does not burn politely. It cracks and groans, and smoke rolls out like a confession. Texas, suddenly homeless at its own capital, does what desperate institutions always do. It accelerates. There's a particular kind of urgency that comes when pride is threatened. Not the noble urgency of saving lives, the political urgency of saving face. A special session is called. Men arrive in Austin with dust still on their boots from the road, and the city receives them the way it always has. Humid air off the river, the smell of horses, wood smoke from kitchens, sweat drying in collars. They argue about stone and cost and control. They argue about the size of the dome and the message it will send. They argue as if architecture were theology, and under all of it sits the real question, the only one that matters: how do you pay for grandeur when you are cash poor? The answer is waiting in the Panhandle like a loaded rifle leaned in the corner. By 1882, the land is not just land. It is a valuation. It is a number men can speak out loud without feeling foolish. It is an estimate meant to domesticate the wild. The 3 million acres in the Capitol Reservation are priced at a tidy sum, respectable enough to make lawmakers feel like they're steering the ship instead of clinging to wreckage. But numbers on paper don't cut granite, and they don't haul it, and they don't pay wages to the men who will bruise their hands and backs into the foundation of a capital that will outlive them. So Texas goes looking for someone who can convert that land into the kind of capital that moves in the real world. And this is where the legend likes to pretend it's all local. Texans dealing with Texans, a proud state building its own house with its own hands. But the door opens to Chicago, to merchants, to syndicates, to men who understand that land is the oldest currency on earth, and that governments will sell it cheap when they are hungry for stone. You can feel the temperature change when that realization arrives. Because the bargain isn't Texas builds a capital. The bargain is Texas trades away future wealth to purchase present glory. Names enter the story that sound like ledgers. The Farwells, men with national reach, men who can see value in distance the way a hawk sees a mouse in grass. They become the clean face of something larger, a capital syndicate with money behind it and patience in front of it. They will build the present-day capital and take the 3 million acres in exchange. The land becomes payment the way a man hands over a deed when he can't make the banknote. And the legislature, the board, the men with the seals and signatures, they tell themselves a comforting story. The Panhandle is distant. The Panhandle is risky. The Panhandle is a thing you can afford to barter because it is not yet cash. In their minds, they're trading away emptiness. But emptiness is just ignorance with good posture. Out there, the tract that will become the XIT is not unused. It is merely not yet domesticated by law. The grass grows anyway. The wind moves anyway. Water cuts its shallow, stubborn paths through draws and creeks anyway. There are people who know it by touch and season, people not invited into the bargain, people who will not be named in commemorative plaques. A government can declare land public and available and unoccupied, and those words can be true in the way legal words are true. True enough to transfer ownership, true enough to invite fences and shotguns and sheriffs. Here's the part the myth doesn't like. Texas officials were not naive, not entirely. They knew they were making a bet, and a bet is a kind of confession. It admits uncertainty. It admits a willingness to gamble with other people's future. So, when the origin story is told as a clean act of civic pride, remember the smell beneath it. Hot paper and smoke from the burned Capitol. The nervous sweat of lawmakers who suddenly need a building, the quiet excitement of men who know a land deal when they see one. Remember that the state's dignity had a price tag, and the price tag was measured in acres instead of dollars. And when you hear the number, 3 million, don't hear it as poetry. Hear it as a transaction. Because before there were cowboys under that brand, before there were line camps and windmills and herds counted in the tens of thousands, there was this: a government choosing stone over soil, choosing immediate splendor over distant stewardship. A decision made under chandeliers and in committee rooms, far from the Panhandle's weather, far from the people who would later ride those fences and dig those wells and bury their dead in that hard ground. Was this thrift? Or was it a kind of official desperation dressed up as vision? And if it was desperation, whose desperation was it really? The state wanted a capital that looked like permanence, and it found a way to build it. But the land remembers. The land always remembers. They say the XIT was born out of Texas pride, a grand bargain between honorable men, stone for grass, sealed the way old stories like to seal things, with a handshake and a promise and the clean belief that the frontier was still too big to be owned. But the truth was a printed notice in an Austin newspaper. The truth was a bid sheet. The truth was a room with ink in it and men who knew how to wait. By May of 1881, the state had already chosen its dream. After a nationwide design competition announced the year before, an award of one that's our $1,700 dangle like bait, Texas officials approved the plan submitted by Detroit architect Elijah E. Myers. The building was imagined in Renaissance Revival confidence, a capital meant to stand up to Washington's shadow and not blink. In Austin that spring, there would have been a sense of arriving, the river air thick, the city still small enough to smell of horses and wet limestone, and in the rooms where the Capitol Board met, the talk would have carried the weight of a thing that could outlast all of them. But architecture is only the first fantasy. The second is funding. So the building commission did what desperate governments always do. They advertised for a contractor who would build the Capitol, not for cash, but for land. 3 million acres of public ground set aside in the Panhandle by the Constitution of 1876 and put into motion by legislation in 1879. A barter on a scale that feels almost biblical if you don't look too close at the paperwork, not money changing hands, the earth itself. If you've never watched a public contract being born, you might picture it as ceremonial. But it's closer to a cattle auction than a wedding. You set terms, you listen, you compare hunger, The state received only 2 bids. That detail, all by itself, tells you something about the nature of the gamble. 2, not 10, not 20. 2 men looked at Texas and said, "Yes, I will trade labor and materials for an enormous rectangle of wind and grass that I may never see." One of them was Matthias Schnell of Rock Island, Illinois. The other was Alfred Andrew Burke of Rockdale, Texas. 2 bids and 1 state house that had already burned once and did not want to burn again. Schnell got the contract. You can imagine the moment, the sound of paper being slid across a table, the scratch of a pen that pauses just long enough for a man to consider how much of his life is about to become dependent on weather. Men leaning forward in their chairs with the careful posture of people pretending they are calm. Outside, the world goes on. Wagons rattle. A mule brays somewhere. But inside that room, Texas is deciding that a building can be bought by selling the future. And here's where the Chicago comes in, quiet as a knife slipping between ribs. Schnell did not hold the contract long. He assigned 3/4 of it to a Chicago firm called Taylor. Babcock and Company, men with money behind them, men with supply lines and credit, and the kind of distance in their eyes that comes from living where the horizon is made of buildings, not grass. The principals were Abner Taylor, Amos C. Babcock, and the brothers Charles B. Farwell and John V. Farwell, names that sound like commerce, because that is what they were: dry goods, rail connections, banking confidence. Men who knew that the West did not have to be romantic to be profitable. A few months later, Schnell signed over the rest of the contract to the same firm. The handshake legend dies right there, under fluorescent truth. There is no lone Texan building a capital with local muscle. There is a syndicate swallowing a deal whole. Abner Taylor became chief contractor, and then even he, in a move that tells you what the work actually was, subcontracted the building to a young Chicago builder named Gustav Wilke. That's how these empires really form: layers of distance. Responsibility pushed down the chain like water seeking the lowest point. The men who sign the first papers are often not the men who lift the first stone. The state, for its part, tried to make the numbers behave. In 1882, the 3 million acres were valued at $1.5 million. A tidy estimate meant to make this exchange look balanced, civic, reasonable. But reasonableness is what you call a wager when you don't want to admit it's a wager. The capital would eventually cost $3,544,630.60, and the state would assume about $500,000 of that. In other words, the land was never simply extra. It was the core currency. It was the thing that made the whole machine move. And the men in Chicago understood something else, too, something Texans often don't like to say out loud about their own myths, that the land was undervalued not because it was worthless, but because it was far away from the people doing the valuing. Distance creates discounts. A lawmaker in Austin can look at the Panhandle and see a blank. A financier in Chicago can look at the same blank and see a future. He can see railroad extension. He can see population pressure. He can see a time coming, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next year, when the nation will reach out its hands and want more room. The trick is simply to be holding the deed when that hunger arrives. So you have these two forces meeting in 1882, Texas pride in need of a building and outside capital in need of an instrument. The capital syndicate did not need to love Texas to profit from Texas. It only needed to believe that Texas would keep growing, and Texas, for its part, did what governments do when they've cornered themselves. It treated land like a bottomless account. It treated acreage as if it were an inexhaustible resource, like air, like sunlight, because the people making the decision did not have to stand in the cold later and defend it with fence lines and hired men and gunfire and law. The myth wants you to picture the creation of the XIT as a frontier romance. But look at what actually happens in these moments. Paper precedes blood. Ink precedes fence wire. A capital is imagined, then contracted, then subcontracted, and somewhere far away a stretch of country is marked for conversion, public to private, without anyone in Austin having to walk it. And that is the pivot. Because once you've traded for land, you have to take possession of it in a way that courts will respect. You have to make the wilderness legible to bureaucracy. You have to turn grass into geometry. You have to measure. So what happens when you try to turn 3 million acres of wind and distance into a legally defensible shape? When you send men out with chains and compasses to count a country that does not want to be counted. They told it like the land was just there, a great vacant platter set at the edge of Texas, waiting for somebody honest enough to claim it. They'll tell you the XIT was simply granted, as if a governor reached into the drawer and handed over a neat rectangle, already measured, already known. But the truth is, the land did not arrive as a rectangle. It arrived as an argument. It arrived as wind and distance and men with instruments trying to make wilderness hold still long enough to be written down. 3 million acres is not something you hand over. It is something you have to manufacture out of field notes and stakes, and the fragile idea that a line drawn on paper can command a prairie that has never learned obedience. In 1882, when the capital contract and its land payment hardened into reality, the problem waiting behind the signatures was simple and brutal. Where exactly was this payment? And how do you prove it belongs to you? So they sent surveyors. Not the romantic surveyors of paintings, not noble explorers in clean shirts. These were working men with sunburnt necks and cracked hands and the patience of mules, men who carried the tools of translation, compass, chain, flag, notebook, and the quiet authority of a pencil, a Gunter's chain, 66 feet long, made of linked iron, heavy as a promise. Every length counted aloud, every count a chance to be wrong. The Panhandle does not greet you. It tests you. You come up out of the broken country and onto the high plains, and it feels like stepping into a different kind of time. The Llano Estacado, the staked plains, flat enough to make a man doubt his own eyes, yet cruelly alive with subtle rises and shallow draws that can swallow a wagon if you're careless. The light is hard. The sky sits low and enormous. The wind never negotiates. It presses against you with the steady contempt of something older than law. Somewhere ahead, invisible until you're almost on it, lies the edge of New Mexico. The border is not a fence. It is an agreement between governments. You can stand on it and feel nothing change except the story men tell themselves about where they are. And this is where the XIT's body would be assembled, along that western seam, eventually stretching roughly 200 miles north to south, and in places 20 to 30 miles wide, draped across 10 Panhandle counties like a long shadow cast at noon. Those numbers come later, after the pain. First, there is only the work. A survey crew moves like a small army. One man sights the compass, another walks the chain, another holds the flag at the far point. a thin splash of color against miles of grass. There is a cook somewhere with a wagon, and the smell of grease and coffee follows them like a faint hope. They sleep on the ground. Their blankets collect burrs and dust. Their boots are always damp with dew in the morning and always gritty by noon. When a blue norther comes down, it comes like a punishment. When the heat arrives, it arrives with the blank stare of the sun. They are not just measuring space, they are measuring ownership. Because ownership out here is a trick that requires witnesses. In Texas, land had been parceled through a long history of grants and surveys, Spanish and Mexican leagues, Republic-era claims, state sections, each with its own geometry and its own ghosts. A Texas league, that old unit of empire, comes out to roughly 4,128 acres, a number that feels ridiculous until you're the one trying to walk its edges. But the capital lands weren't romantic grants from a king. They were a state's collateral, 3 million acres set aside by a constitution and then made real by selection and survey, like a debt you can't dodge. And every mile the crew walked carried a quiet temptation, make it come out a little better for the men who hired you. Because the land they were assembling was not a single obvious piece of ground with a fence around it. It had to be chosen, stitched together out of available public domain in the Panhandle, contiguous, defensible, valuable, close to the New Mexico line because the map allowed it and because distance from Austin kept the public's eyes soft. The farther a thing is from the seat of power, the easier it is to turn into profit. The errors begin small, the way all big scandals begin. A compass needle does not point to true north. It points to magnetic north, which wanders over the years like a drunk. A man can correct for declination, but correction is only as good as the numbers he trusts and the patience he has left at the end of a long day. The chain sags. The chain stretches when it's hot and tightens when it's cold. The men are tired, hungry, sunstruck. A stake goes down in the wrong clump of grass. A note gets smudged by sweat. A count is called wrong, and no one wants to admit it because admitting it means walking back. You don't steal 3 million acres in one grab. You steal it by letting 1,000 small close enoughs pile up into certainty. The crew writes field notes at night by lamplight. Paper is thin, ink bleeds. The scratch of the pencil is the only sound besides wind pushing at the wagon canvas. The words they write are plain: thence, bearing, distance, corner. The language of possession is always boring. That's how it survives. It hides inside tedium, and while they work, the land watches. Antelope lift their heads and stare and then vanish, white rumps flashing like mockery. Coyotes yip from somewhere you can't see. In the distance, thunderstorms build like dark cities and then collapse into rain that never seems to reach you. Some days the air smells of sweet grass and sun-warmed soil. Other days it smells of nothing at all, like the world has been scrubbed clean. When the lines finally start to connect, when the corners begin to speak to each other across miles, something changes. The prairie becomes legible. It becomes a thing you can argue over in court. A man in Chicago can point at a plat and say, "This is mine," without ever feeling the wind. And that is the true beginning of the XIT, not cattle, not cowboys, not romance. A survey is a spell. It takes a place that belongs to weather and makes it belong to paperwork. But spells have costs, because once you have lines on a page, you must defend them. Once you have corners in the ground, you have to keep them from being moved. Once you've turned open range into geometry, you have to decide what comes next. Do you leave it as a map and a speculation, or do you build the machinery to make it produce? Wells, windmills, fences, line camps, payrolls, rules, and if the land has finally been counted into submission, how do you turn that count into an empire that can actually run? They like to paint it as one man and one horse and a sky big enough to forgive anything. The cowboy alone out there, living by instinct and honor, carving an empire from grass with nothing but a rope and a good eye. But the truth was a machine. And machines have ledgers, machines have supervisors, machines have schedules that don't care if you're tired or sentimental or half frozen in a blue norther. The XIT did not run on lone heroes. It ran on payroll and wire and water, on men doing jobs so repetitive and so punishing, you stop calling it adventure and start calling it industry. The Panhandle is where Texas thins out into pure distance. Along the New Mexico line, the country runs long, about 200 miles north to south, and the strip they claimed varied from 20 to 30 miles wide, a shape that looks simple on paper and feels impossible underfoot. The Canadian River cuts the land like a scar, and south of it the water gets meaner, harder to find, the kind you have to drill for and drag up by force. North of it, around Buffalo Springs, the ground will sometimes give you mercy. So they put the first headquarters there, Buffalo Springs, on the northern boundary of the ranch, because you don't start a machine in a place where the machine can't drink. It's 1885 when the operation truly begins, when cattle are purchased and moved onto the range, and the first real work starts. Not writing, but organizing. Inside the office at Buffalo Springs, the air is stale with paper and tobacco. There's a table scarred by knife cuts and ink rings. A man sits with a pen that keeps catching on the grain of cheap paper. His name might not make the folklore. The stories don't like men who sit down, but someone has to. Someone has to turn weather into numbers. George Findlay is there, directing business, and around him the ranch takes its first breath as an institution. Outside, the wind snaps at the canvas of wagons. Horses stand with their heads low, half asleep, tails switching. A cook dumps grounds into a pot, and the smell of coffee spreads like a thin promise. Men gather in twos and threes, not talking much, because talking wastes heat. The general manager, Colonel B. H. Campbell, has the kind of posture you get from commanding things. He speaks short. He points. He expects the world to obey. Beneath him is a range foreman, Barry Nations, who knows the country in a way the colonel never will. Nations watches faces, watches clouds, watches grass height, the way a banker watches interest. He knows what a herd can take and what a man can take, and he knows both are limited. A machine this big doesn't start with cattle. It starts with lines. Fencing operations begin in 1884, before the main herd even settles. Because without fence, you don't own anything you can defend. Fence is how you make a claim. Physical. Fence is how you take a myth called open range and replace it with a reality called trespass. Barbed wire arrives by rail in carloads, and the numbers are blunt. 300 carloads of fencing materials purchased for $181,000. You can almost hear that figure land on a desk in Chicago like a weight. Out on the plains, it becomes something else. Coils of wire stacked like sleeping snakes, posts piled in rough pyramids, kegs of staples, stretchers, augers, axes, shovels, the tools of a quiet conquest, A crew heads out before dawn, breath steaming, bedrolls tied behind saddles, a chuck wagon creaking along behind. The ground is stiff with frost. The men are already sore from yesterday and the day before that. They reach a point where the survey says the line should run. There's no landmark worth naming, just grass and sky and wind. One man sets the first post. He swings a maul, and each blow makes a flat, dead sound like pounding a lid shut. The post goes in slow because the earth doesn't like being told what to do. Another man unrolls wire. It snarls, catches, whips back with a spiteful snap. Gloves help, but the barbs always find a way to taste skin. The wire sings when it's pulled tight, a thin high note that carries farther than you'd expect. They string it 4 strands high, 4 wire barbed wire, because 1 strand is a suggestion and 4 is a statement. The fence line has to be straight enough to satisfy the map. But the prairie doesn't offer straightness for free. It offers wind and mirage and small rises that trick the eye. You sight, you walk, you correct, you pound another post, you stretch again. By 1886, the XIT has 781 miles of fence in place, including a 260-mile west line and a 275-mile east line. 2 long arms of wire reaching down the New Mexico border like a net being drawn tight. Those numbers are the ranch's first real heartbeat. They mean the machine is starting to close its grip. And once the perimeter is there, the inside has to be divided. Not for romance, for control. Division headquarters appear like islands of human insistence. Buffalo Springs, Middlewater, Ojo Bravo, Rito Blanco, Escarbada, Spring Lake, Yellow Houses, 7 names that sound like landmarks because they were, each one equipped with the same practical anatomy: residences, cellars, bunkhouses, storerooms, barns, corrals, and a freight outfit that can haul what the land refuses to provide. Later, they add bovina, because the machine grows new joints as it learns what it needs. The seasons dictate the labor the way a foreman dictates shifts. In winter, a division might run with 10 to 12 cowboys, just enough to keep the place from falling apart, to ride line and check water, and push strays back into the arithmetic. In summer, the number swells to 25 or 30, because grass and calves and lightning and sickness all arrive at once, and the machine must meet them with bodies. And the cattle, those are numbers too, not characters. By 1887, the herd is held between 125,000 and 150,000 head, and the land allotment is about 20 acres per animal. A calculation that tells you how hungry the range is, how much space a single cow requires just to stay alive without eating the place down to dirt. 20 acres for 1 animal. Multiply it out, and you can feel the scale in your jaw. But fence alone doesn't keep cattle alive. Wire won't quench thirst. So the second half of the machine is water, dragged up from darkness. South of the Canadian River, the surface water is stingy. The ranch starts sinking wells, and by the turn of the century, the scale is almost obscene. 335 windmills producing water from an average depth of 125 feet, plus 100 earthen dams thrown up with teams and scrapers, trying to make rain hold still long enough to be useful. The windmills turn day and night, the blades clicking and whirring, a sound like time itself. Being measured, in 1888, they string a telephone line connecting Tascosa to Alamocitos, thin wire carrying voices across the emptiness. Men who once had to ride all day to deliver a message can now speak it into a receiver with dust still on their lips. The machine gets faster. The machine becomes harder to escape. And here is what the mythology never admits. A ranch like this doesn't just contain cattle. It contains information. Each division writes monthly and annual reports, cattle counts, weather notes, losses, hires, fires. The land itself becomes data. A storm becomes a line item. A drought becomes a forecast. A man dying out on the range becomes a brief notation if the work continues. By 1890, the general headquarters moves to Channing, closer to the growing lines of rail and settlement, closer to the world that will eventually consume the ranch by turning it into towns and fields. The office building becomes another cog. Desks, files, maps pinned flat like captured animals. So you can stand back now and see it. Not a cowboy story, but an apparatus. Fence miles, windmills, pastures, division stations, reports, rules. A private government laid over a public landscape, operating with the cold efficiency of anyone who has promised investors a return. Which brings you to the question the wind keeps asking. The question the ledgers try not to hear. Who, exactly, paid for all this wire and water and wages? Was it built on saddle leather and grit alone, or on distant money expecting its due? They say the money came up out of the ground like water. That the XIT was paid for the way a man pays for a ranch in the old stories. One good season stacked on another, cattle sold high, debts kept small, the whole thing running on Texas grit and a handshake. But the truth was paper, the truth was debt. The truth was men in far rooms who never smelled the Panhandle after rain, deciding by the calm lift of a pen whether the biggest ranch on earth would breathe another year. Picture a morning in Chicago in the mid-1880s. Not the clean Chicago of postcards, the working one. Coal smoke threaded through the streets, streetcars grinding on rails, the river dark and slow and full of things nobody wants to name. Inside a dry goods office, Taylor Babcock, there are ledgers thick as Bibles and a clerk with ink on his fingers, turning pages the way a man turns soil. The numbers are neat. The sums are cruel. Somewhere else, across an ocean, there are investors who will never see Amarillo, never see Tascosa, never hear wind catching in barbed wire like a high, thin scream. They will see only columns, acres, cattle, interest, maturity dates. The West is not a place to them. It's a security. Because a ranch of 3,000 acres does not run on romance. It runs on cash flow. And the Panhandle, for all its grass, does not mint cash. You have to move the value out of it in the form of cattle, live weight turned into dollars, then keep the machine fed with more wire, more wells, more men, more horses, more repairs. A single windmill might look simple from a distance, but it has bearings and bolts and wood that splits and veins that crack. A single mile of fence looks like nothing, until you try to string 781 miles of it and keep it tight in a country that never stops pushing back. So the syndicate does what the syndicate was designed to do. It borrows. It raises money against the promise of future earnings. It turns the ranch into an instrument, something you can sell pieces of in the form of obligations to people hungry for returns. There is a kind of dark genius in it, because the ranch had two products. One was beef, the other was time. Beef paid the wages. Time was supposed to pay the investors. Out on the range, the work is blunt. In 1885, when the herd begins to settle and the operation takes its living shape, the men are counting animals and counting losses, trying to turn a raw land deal into a functioning organism. By 1887, the herd is sitting in that enormous range, 125,000 to 150,000 head, a number so large it stops being a herd and becomes a moving weather system. And the arithmetic of survival is equally brutal. about 20 acres per animal, because the grass is sparse and the distances between water are long, and a cow can eat a country down to bone if you crowd her. But in offices, the talk is different. In offices, those cattle are inventory. Those acres are collateral. The men who manage the paper want to know, what are we netting per head? How many are lost to drought? How many to winter? How many to theft? What's the freight cost per rail shipment? What's the market doing back east, Kansas City, Chicago, St. Louis, where beef becomes price instead of an animal's breath? And every time the market softens, the machine shudders. Because the XIT is expensive even when it's healthy. The fence bill alone tells you what kind of enterprise this is. 300 carloads of fencing supplies for $181,000. That's not cowboy life. That's infrastructure. That's the kind of cost that has to be justified to men who prefer a dividend to a sunrise. So, letters travel. From the Panhandle to Chicago. From Chicago to New York. From New York to London. Sheets of paper crossing miles of ocean, carrying the daily life of a ranch in a language stripped of dust and suffering. A storm becomes losses. A disease becomes shrinkage. A man breaking his leg 50 miles from help becomes nothing at all, unless his death affects production. There's a night, you can imagine it, when a manager sits at a desk in Channing, later the headquarters, by 1890, and the lamp flame is small and steady, and the window rattles in the wind. He's tired, and he's honest enough to feel the weight of what he's doing. He opens a report. He writes down numbers that will be read by someone who has never been cold in this way. He knows every number is an argument. Every number is a plea. Keep funding us. Keep believing. The grass will pay you back. The cruel part is that sometimes it does. A good run of weather fattens cattle. A strong market lifts prices. Rail connections shorten the time between range and buyer. On those days, the machine looks invincible. It feels like the West is finally cooperating. And then it doesn't. The Panhandle is not predictable. It is not polite. A dry spell comes and grass turns brittle. Wind scours the ground until the land itself looks exhausted. Calves drop light. Cows walk farther for water and lose weight in the search. When the winter comes hard, it comes like a verdict. Ice on the wire, snow hiding the grass, cattle drifting in blind herds, noses crusted with frost, bawling like lost children. Losses don't arrive one at a time. They arrive in piles. And through all of it, the debt does not care. Interest does not pause for a drought. So the XIT's wealth, the kind people like to imagine, was never simply sitting out there in the cattle. It was always split. Half in the living herd, half in the expectation that the land itself would someday be sold at a higher price than it was paid for. The cattle were the cover charge. The land was the main event. That's why the story has teeth when you look at it long enough, because the ranch was never only ranching. It was a waiting game played with other people's labor. The cowboys riding fence in sleet didn't own the upside. The cooks boiling coffee at dawn didn't own it. The fence crews bleeding on barbs didn't own it. Even the managers, in their stiff collars, were often just trying to keep the thing upright long enough for the real money to arrive. And while all of this was happening, while investors watched returns and foremen watched clouds, Texas was building a capital meant to proclaim permanence. Stone by stone, the dome rising, the granite setting, the state presenting itself to history as something stable and grand. So tell me, when that capital finally stood there in Austin, like a promise made physical? Was it a monument to public pride? Or was it the most elegant receipt ever written for a kingdom bought with wire and debt? They say the Capitol went up the way cathedrals go up in the stories, out of civic pride and local hands and a sort of clean Texas willpower. They say the dome rose because the people wanted it, because the state deserved it, because destiny demanded a monument. But the truth is, the building was purchased with a faraway silence. The truth is that while the stone was being set in Austin, a stretch of Panhandle grass, 3,000 acres of it, was being converted by paperwork and wire into the kind of asset that could pay bills, not with ceremony, with arithmetic. Austin in the mid-1880s is not yet the glossy capital it pretends to be later. It's still a river town with government ambitions. Hot summers that lay on a man's shoulders like wet burlap. Winters that can be mild until they aren't. Streets that turn to mud when it rains and to dust when it doesn't. And over it all, the sense that Texas is trying to announce itself to the rest of the country, trying to say, we are not a provincial holdover, we are a state of weight and permanence. So they build with granite, pink granite, hard as pride, hauled in heavy blocks that don't care about human backs. Teams straining, wheels groaning, men shouting in short bursts because longer sentences are wasted breath when you're moving stone. The mortar smells like lime and water and grit. The clang of tools carries off the walls and into the street. And day after day the structure rises in the slow, stubborn way big things rise. One block, then the next, until the shape becomes undeniable. But even as the capital grows, it is never purely Texan, the way the myth insists. The contract itself had already migrated north, through assignment and reassignment, until the work belonged in practice to a syndicate and its subcontractors. The state's dream had been outsourced, parceled out like a shipment, managed by men who understood scale and supply and the patient virtue of other people's labor. And out on the edge of Texas, the payment was taking form in its own brutal way. While Austin watched stone climb toward the sky, the Panhandle watched fences stretch across the horizon. By 1886, the XIT had already thrown up 781 miles of fence. Wire turned into borders. Borders turned into a private kingdom. And the bill for that first great act of enclosure was not small talk around a campfire. It was 300 carloads of fencing materials for $181,000, a number that smells like iron and blood if you've ever pulled barbed wire tight in winter and felt it bite through your glove. This is the part the monument doesn't show you. The building in Austin casts a shadow shaped like wire. Inside the Capitol board's papers and valuations, the trade had been made to look balanced. In 1882, the land was treated as a neat sum, $1.5 million for 3 million acres, a way of pretending the future could be priced cleanly. But the Capitol, once all was said and paid, carried a cost that landed heavier than any estimate, $3,144,630 plus $60, with the state assuming roughly $500,000 of that burden itself. Numbers like that don't feel like marble halls. They feel like weight. They feel like obligation. They feel like the kind of thing that demands repayment from somewhere, and the somewhere was always the land. So imagine a day in 1888 when the building is effectively complete, when the dome is there, and the stone has settled into its final authority, and the city gathers in its Sunday clothing to look up at what their government has become. The air is bright. The light off that granite is almost tender. There are speeches because There are always speeches when men want to convince themselves they have done something pure. The words will be about civilization and progress and the greatness of Texas. The words will not be about the Panhandle. But a capital is not built by speeches. It is built by the invisible workforce, the men who cut and hauled, the men who lifted and set, the men who mixed mortar until their hands cracked, the men who slept in cheap quarters and woke up sore and went back to work, because wages are wages. It is built by clerks counting materials and foremen counting minutes. It is built by people whose names do not end up on plaques, people who cannot afford pride, people who give their bodies to a public dream and are paid in private money. And the XIT, this other monument made of wire and windmills, was built the same way. The ranch had a brand that looked like a joke until you understood the reason behind it. XIT, 3 characters chosen not for poetry, but for control. Because a complicated brand can be altered, and a simple one is harder to counterfeit. Even identity out there was an anti-theft measure, a corporate scar burned into hide to protect an investment. This is what happens when wealth stops being personal and becomes institutional. Even the romance is engineered, so on the day the Capitol stands there, shining with its newness, the syndicate can look at 2 monuments at once, one of stone in Austin and one of wire and acreage up north. One is public and celebrated, the other is private and defended. One has speeches, the other has line riders in sleet, checking corners that surveyors marked and fence crews hammered into reluctant ground. And for a little while, the arrangement looks like it might work. The Capitol gives Texas a face. The ranch gives the syndicate a future. Cattle move. Grass grows back. Reports travel east with tidy figures. Investors breathe easier. Managers plan bigger. But monuments don't care about markets, and markets don't care about monuments. A building can stand serene while a price collapses. A dome can glow pink in the evening while an empire on the plains bleeds money with every dead steer and every mile of fence that needs repair. So what happens when the weather turns mean and the cattle market turns colder than the wind, when the grand bargain meets its first real reckoning in dollars and death? They say the big outfits never really worried, that a ranch with 3,000 acres under it could ride out any storm, ride out any market, ride out any bad run of luck the way a battleship rides out chop, heavy, indifferent, invulnerable. But the truth is, a cow can't eat acreage, a man can't pay interest with horizon, and a ledger doesn't care how grand the story sounds when you tell it later. It begins the way trouble often begins, not with thunder, but with paper. A morning comes, let's put it in 1887, when the XIT is already swollen to something like 125,000 to 150,000 head, and the machine is fully awake. Before daylight, down at a shipping point, you can hear cattle shifting in the pens, the low, steady complaining of them, the clack of hooves on planks, the harsh cough of dust in a man's throat. Men are moving with that tight, practiced economy, no wasted steps, because every extra motion is another ache you carry into the next day. A gate swings, a steer bumps through, shoulders rubbing the rails. A cowboy slaps the flank with his hat, not angry, just insistent. Another man stands by the scale, stiff-backed, half squinting in the dim, calling weights to a clerk whose pencil moves like it's being chased. Numbers fall into the book: 1,080, 1,140, 980. A page fills another page. The air smells of manure and iron and that sharp green note you get when grass is trampled hard enough to bleed. A whistle sounds from the engine. Steam rolls up in the cold, white and thick, and it carries the smell of coal, an industrial stink that doesn't belong to the plains but has arrived anyway, the way everything arrives eventually. Rail cars wait like open mouths. Loading chutes thump under hooves. The cattle don't understand that they are leaving the only country they've ever known. They only understand pressure and noise and the narrow funnel of wood forcing them forward. And the men understand something else. Once those cattle are on the train, they become money, potential money, moving toward a market that can bless the ranch or break it. By noon, the clerk's fingers are black with graphite and his lips are cracked from wind. He closes the ledger with a soft slap, and for a second he just stares at it, as if he can't quite believe a life can be reduced to a column. That afternoon, back at headquarters, there's a different kind of work. A room with a desk, maps pinned flat, a safe in the corner. A manager sits with a telegram folded in his hand, reading it twice, not because he didn't understand it the first time, but because he wants it to change when he looks again. The price is down. It doesn't matter if it's down a little or down a lot. What matters is that it's down while the costs remain up. Costs don't fall because the market feels gloomy. Fence still breaks in the wind. Windmills still need parts. Horses still eat. Men still draw wages. The ranch has already paid $181,000 for 300 carloads of fencing, and by 1886 it has thrown up 781 miles of wire that now has to be patrolled, tightened, repaired. Wire is not a one-time purchase. It's a permanent argument with weather. Outside, the day is bright and pitiless. Inside, the air is stale, warmed by bodies and bad news. The manager looks at the telegram, then at the wall map. That enormous strip along the New Mexico line looks calm from a distance, like a clean idea. He knows better. He knows it's 7 divisions of trouble, scattered water, thin grass, men who get sick, and horses that go lame, and cattle that die quietly in draws where nobody finds them until the smell tells the truth. He reaches for a report, monthly counts, losses, tallies by division. He reads numbers the way a man reads a diagnosis. A few more deaths than expected. Calves lighter. A windmill down at one station. A dam breached at another. Nothing catastrophic in any single line, but in a ranch this size, a little becomes a disaster simply by multiplication. And then the weather joins in. The Panhandle has a way of turning on you without drama. A dry spell comes, and you can smell it before you see it. The grass loses its sweetness, turns brittle, and when you walk through it, you hear that faint snapping like paper tearing. The ground cracks. The cattle drift farther, searching. They chew slower. Their ribs begin to show. When you ride out, you see dust where you used to see green. A wind comes up, always a wind, and it carries grit that stings your eyes. It worries the fences. It turns a windmill too fast until something gives, and the blades shudder and then stop. And the only sound left is the squeal of dry bearings and the distant lowing of thirsty cattle that don't know why the water is gone. Men go out to fix it with tools that are never quite the right tools. They climb the tower with their hands cold on metal, and the wind rocks them up there like a slow threat. Below, cattle crowd the tank, shoving, bawling, turning the ground to black soup. A cowboy kicks at a stuck float valve, cusses under his breath, then leans his forehead against the tank rim for a second, just 1 second, because exhaustion is a kind of drowning. And through all of it, the market stays down. That's the part nobody sings about. They'll sing about blizzards. They'll sing about stampedes. They won't sing about a buyer in a city deciding the price of beef is softer this week. They won't sing about credit tightening. They won't sing about men who have never seen the Panhandle feeling cautious, and that caution traveling west like a bullet you can't dodge. A ranch like this is a machine, and machines run on timing. You need good grass when you need it. You need a good market when you ship. You need investors who remain patient long enough for the land to appreciate the way it's supposed to. When timing fails, scale stops being strength and becomes weight. Out on the range, the cowboys feel it in smaller ways first. A foreman tells them to tighten belts, literally, because the chuck wagon is a little lighter than it used to be. A man's pay is late, not missed, just late. Late is enough to sour a camp. Late is enough to turn jokes quiet. Late is enough to make a man wonder if he should ride south and find work somewhere smaller, somewhere the boss isn't waiting on a telegram from Chicago or a letter from London, and the managers, those men in offices, start to make choices that don't feel like ranching at all. Where can we cut? Which repairs can wait? How many hands can we let go and still keep the lines ridden? Do we ship now at a bad price or hold and gamble that prices rise while the cattle grow thinner? A decision is made with a pen, and then another, and then another, and each decision feels reasonable in isolation. But the ranch, taken as a whole, begins to show a new face, not invulnerable, not mythic, but fragile in the way any leveraged thing is fragile, because it was never just cattle. It was always a wager, beef today, land tomorrow. And when beef falters, the question shifts, subtle at first, then louder. If the money can't be wrung from cattle, will it be wrung from the land itself? And if that's where the real value lies, if the true payday is in selling pieces of this place, what happens when the rest of the world starts pressing in, not with brands and saddles, but with plows and deeds and the stubborn hunger to own a smaller piece of the same sky? They say the Panhandle was empty. They say the big ranches fenced nothing but wind. They say the settlers came later, politely, with deeds in their pockets and prayers on their tongues, and that everybody found a way to live side by side under the same hard sky. But the truth is, the range fought back, and not with speeches, with wire cutters, with torches, with men who rode at night and did not announce themselves, with farmers who looked at a fence line and saw not property, but insult, with cowboys who looked at a plowed furrow and saw the end of their wage. Out there, on that long strip pressed against New Mexico, roughly 3,000 acres laid out like a claim, ownership was not a philosophy. It was a physical fact. By 1886, the XIT had already thrown up 781 miles of fence, and wire like that does something to a landscape. It changes what people believe they're allowed to do. It turns a horizon into a decision. Do you go around it? Do you go through it? Or do you cut it and let the night take the blame? The ranch's country ran across 10 counties: Dallam, Hartley, Oldham, Potter, Randall, Deaf Smith, Palmer, Castro, Swisher, Briscoe. Names that sound like courthouse signs because that's what they'd become. But in the 1880s and 1890s, those names were still more idea than place. They were new lines laid over old grass, waiting for the rest of America to come fill them with debt and churches and fences of a different kind. The Panhandle wind does not carry sound far the way you'd expect. It snatches it and scatters it. A man can shout, and the prairie will swallow it like it was never said. That helps at night. Night is when the range speaks its honest language. A homesteader, call him what he is, a poor man with a family and a shovel, comes up into the country with a wagon that complains at every rut. The wheels are rawhide wrapped and cracking. The canvas top flaps like a tired flag. He's got sacks of flour, a cast-iron skillet, a few boards, and the kind of optimism that only exists when a man doesn't fully understand what he's just committed himself to. His wife rides beside him with the baby bundled tight, and the baby's face is pinched from cold. Their older boy walks behind, dragging a stick through the dust because he doesn't know what else to do with his hands. They reach a fence line at dusk. It runs straight as a judgment. Posts driven into stubborn ground. Barbed wire stretched tight enough to sing when the wind hits it. No gate where they need one. No sign that says welcome. Just a border that insists, without words, "You're not supposed to be here." The man stares at it a long time. He's tired. He's angry. He's afraid. Those emotions don't separate cleanly on the plains. They come as a single taste in the mouth. He looks left and right for a break. There isn't one. The fence doesn't care about his family. The fence doesn't care about the baby's cough. He could turn back, but turn back to what? So he does what men do when they feel trapped by a decision someone else made on paper. He decides the paper cannot be the last word. He finds a low spot. He throws a blanket over the wire to keep it from tearing the canvas. He lifts the front wheel of the wagon by brute force and pushes until it bumps over. The wire bites anyway. It always does. A barb catches the edge of his sleeve and rips it. He doesn't even look down. He's past the point of caring about fabric. Somewhere out in the dark, a line rider hears the faint metallic twang and sits up in his bedroll. He listens. He hears it again, subtle, like a whisper. He pulls on his boots. He steps outside. The stars are sharp and numerous, the way they get when the air is clean enough to cut you. He spits into the dirt. It freezes before it settles. He saddles his horse without speaking. That rider isn't a villain in his own mind. He's a working man protecting a wage. The ranch has rules. The ranch has boundaries. He's been told that if you let people cross wherever they please, you won't have a ranch. You'll have a rumor, and rumors don't pay. So he rides. And this is the collision, not good versus evil, hunger versus hunger. The XIT, for all its size, was never only cattle. It was a system designed to hold value until value could be extracted. The land itself was the long play. Even early on, the talk of colonization floated around big outfits like Incense, sell parcels, bring in settlers under terms favorable to the company, turn grass into deeds, and deeds into cash. On paper, it sounds orderly. Out there, it happens through friction. Because settlers don't arrive as neat parcels. They arrive unevenly, some with real intent, some speculators, some drifters who will leave the moment the first dry year comes. They claim spots near water. They put up sod houses because wood is a luxury. They cut the first furrow, and the earth comes up in heavy slabs that smell sweet and ancient. They plant, praying the rain will find them. They dig. They build a windbreak with whatever they can drag from miles away. They learn quickly that the land doesn't reward hope. It rewards stubbornness. And the ranch watches them like a disease moving across skin. Because each new homestead is a hole in the logic of the open range. A plowed field is a fence you don't need wire for. A corn patch is a reason cattle can't drift. A family with a claim is a future lawsuit, a future boundary dispute, a future sheriff asked to pick sides in a country where the sheriff still owes money to someone. The violence doesn't always announce itself as violence. Sometimes it looks like bureaucracy. A ranch agent shows up with papers and a polite voice and asks questions that aren't questions. A settler goes to a land office and finds out the file isn't where it's supposed to be. A man gets told his claim overlaps someone else's survey. Just a mistake, they say. Just a technicality. Technicalities are how big interests move without lifting a fist. But sometimes it does become the kind of violence people understand. A fence is found cut in the morning. Clean, deliberate snips, wire drooping like a wounded thing. Cattle drift through the gap, and by noon they're scattered miles out, mixing with other stock. Impossible to sort without days of labor. A ranch crew rides hard, cussing, swinging loops, pushing cattle back through dust that rises in sheets and coats their teeth. A foreman counts losses, not just in head, but in man-hours, in horseflesh, in patience. The next night, the rider takes 2 men with him and goes looking. He finds tracks at a draw. He follows them until they disappear into rock. He knows who did it, or thinks he knows. He knows the kind of poverty that makes a man resent a fence line. He also knows what his boss expects: control. And then the ranch modernizes the way institutions do when they feel threatened, by tightening. By 1888, the XIT is already stringing a telephone line out in that country, connecting points that used to be separated by a day's ride. A voice can travel faster than a horse now. Orders can arrive while the dust is still settling from the problem. The machine gets quicker. The machine gets more certain of itself. Was that efficiency, or was it a net pulling closed? Because when a place stops being open, everything changes. The Old West, real or imagined, begins to suffocate. And in that suffocation, men choose sides, not because they love a cause, because they love their children, because they love their wages, because they love not being told no. And while all this pressure builds on the outside, settlers, speculators, fence cutters, courts, sheriffs, the inside of the enterprise starts to feel it like a stress fracture. The investors want stability. The managers want control. The cowboys want pay. The settlers want a piece of earth they can name. So, when the range begins to revolt against the ranch's attempt to freeze it into property, when the outside world starts prying at those 781 miles of wire and the promise of 3,000 acres, who inside the XIT gets blamed first, and who starts sharpening the knives in the ledger? They say the XIT was too big to quarrel with itself, that an outfit spanning 3,000 acres had no room for petty fights, no need for ego, no time for family feuds. They say the thing ran like a natural law, grass to cattle, cattle to cash, smooth as a river. But the truth is that size doesn't erase human nature. It concentrates it. It puts it under pressure until it turns sharp. Somewhere around the turn of the century, call it 1900, the calendar rolling into a new age the way a blade rolls out of a sheath. There's an office where the air smells of ink and wool and old smoke. Not out on the range, not with wind in your eyes. An office, a place where a man's hands stay clean and still do damage. A clerk lays out the monthly figures. The pages are thin and the numbers heavy. Cattle counts, loss counts, wage totals, repairs, freight. The same story told in different handwriting every month, like a hymn nobody believes anymore. A manager leans over the table and reads without moving his face. He's learned not to show surprise. Surprise is a luxury. He's got a pen between his fingers, and he rolls it back and forth like a small worry. Across that desk, another man waits. A foreman's posture, weathered, restrained. He has dust ground into his cuffs that no washing will ever truly remove. He knows this room is where the decisions get made, but he also knows these decisions are going to be carried out by men who will never see this carpet. The manager taps the page with the pen. Explain this. It's always that, explain, as if the plains owed an explanation, because the story out on the range has stopped matching the story in the books. And when that happens in America, somebody gets blamed. The ranch has been expensive from the beginning. The fence alone, 781 miles strung by 1886, was not some incidental improvement. It was an entire philosophy hammered into the ground. It cost $181,000 just to buy the wire and posts in the first great push. 300 carloads of material hauled into a country that didn't want them. And that was only the beginning. Wire needs riders. Riders need horses. Horses need feed. Water needs windmills and wells and parts. Every mile of ownership has to be defended daily or it becomes a rumor again. And then there's the market. Cold, distant, indifferent. The market is where romance goes to die. So inside the enterprise, the talk gets quieter and sharper. In Chicago, the men tied to the original capital deal, names like Farwell, names that belong to commerce more than to grass, are not looking for poetry. They are looking for returns. They are looking at the same basic figures Texas used to justify the trade in the first place. In 1882, those 3 million acres were valued at $1.5 million, a number meant to make the swap feel clean. And then the capital itself, once finished, carried its own cold truth. A total cost of $630.60, with the state on the hook for roughly $500,000. That building stands like a proclamation, but it also stands like a receipt. A receipt demands payment. Out on the XIT, the machine is still moving, still breathing, cattle still bawl in corrals, chuck wagons still creak out before dawn, windmills still click and whir, but the margins, the narrow strip of mercy between profit and loss, have become a blade's edge. And when you live on a blade's edge, the smallest motion becomes a cut. A foreman reports losses after a hard spell. He doesn't dramatize it. He doesn't have to. He says numbers, and the numbers do the bleeding. A manager replies with questions that sound calm and are not calm at all. Why were the cattle not moved sooner? Why was that windmill down so long? Why were hands hired in that division when another division ran short? The foreman's jaw tightens. He has answers. He always has answers. The answers are weather and distance and fatigue and the simple fact that a man cannot be in two places at once. But answers don't change what's happening. So the questions keep coming, and then the letters arrive. A letter from the East doesn't carry dust. It carries expectation. It carries that faint perfume of authority, polite phrasing wrapped around a threat. The owners want economies. They want efficiencies. They want a plan. They want the ranch to behave like a ledger instead of a living thing. A manager reads those letters and feels his throat go tight. He is caught between worlds. If he squeezes too hard, the operation breaks. If he doesn't squeeze at all, he's replaced by someone who will. This is how empires turn on themselves, not with gunfire, but with adjustments. A hand is let go. Another man is told to do two jobs. Repairs are delayed. Supplies are cut. A winter comes, and the choices made in an office show up as dead cattle in a draw, stiff and swollen, their hides pulled tight over ribs that look like fence slats. And still the pressure builds. Because the XIT has always carried a second purpose beneath the cattle, the land itself. The cattle were the moving part, the visible part, the part that made men feel like it was a ranch story. But the land was the deep part, the slow part, the part that doesn't need a horse to create value, only time and population and rail and law. And by the time you get to 1901, that long-hidden purpose steps into the light. The first significant land sales begin. Not in a grand announcement, not with a trumpet, with paperwork, with parcels, with a quiet shift in the way men talk about the property. The question is no longer, how many head can we run? It becomes, how many acres can we sell without collapsing the whole thing? Inside the organization, that shift is a knife fight, conducted in calm voices. One camp believes, hold the land, wait, the Panhandle will fill, the value will rise, sell later, sell higher. The other camp believes, the ranch is bleeding, the machine costs too much, the market cannot be trusted. Convert the land now. Take the cash while you can, shrink the operation, reduce risk, and hovering over it all is something nobody likes to admit, that the ranch, as a ranch, may never have been the real end game, that it was always a bridge, cattle and wire and payroll used to hold the place together until the moment arrived to sell it off in pieces. Out on the range, the men feel the change before they can name it. They see survey stakes again. They see strangers driving the lines, measuring not for fences, but for deeds. They hear talk in town, quiet talk about openings and opportunities, about acreage being offered, about a man being able to buy a piece of the XIT the way you buy a mule. A cowboy rides past a section line and looks at the horizon and realizes the horizon is no longer a single thing. It's about to become 1,000 small things. And the managers, those men with clean hands and tired eyes, sit at desks and make decisions that will break the ranch apart without ever firing a shot. So here's the real question, the one that turns the stomach if you say it plain. When an empire built on 3,000 acres starts selling itself piece by piece beginning in 1901, is that failure? Or is that the plan finally admitting what it always was, real estate wearing a cowboy hat? They say the XIT died like a wounded bull, one hard season, one bad market, and then it toppled. They like endings that fit in a sentence. They like a clean fall because a clean fall lets you keep the myth. But the truth is, it didn't fall. It unwound, slow, methodical, done with rulers and receipts. By 1901, the ranch had already begun to do the thing it was designed quietly to do all along, convert 3,000 acres of distant grass into money a banker would recognize. Not the loud money of a cattle drive, the quiet money of deeds, the kind that arrives in envelopes, the kind that doesn't bawl or bleed and therefore doesn't haunt you. You can feel the shift in the way people talk. In the old years, a man asked, "How many head you running?" Now the question turns, "How many acres you got for sale?" The vocabulary of the plains changes the way a weather front changes the sky. First a subtle pressure in the air, then a sudden hardness, and you realize you've entered a new season. There's a morning out in the Panhandle, let's set it in late winter, when the ground is still stiff and the wind comes in dry and relentless, a prospective buyer drives into town behind a team that looks like it's been fed hope and not much else. The man is not wealthy. He's not a romantic. He's a gambler with a family. His wife sits wrapped in a shawl, eyes red from cold, holding a baby close enough that the baby's breath warms her throat. The older boy stares at everything like it might disappear. They've heard talk, everyone has, about the big ranch selling. They come into an office with a pot-belly stove that ticks when it heats, and the first smell is coal smoke mixed with wet wool. The walls are hung with maps, not art maps, working maps, big sheets of paper with squares and lines and notations in the margins. The land made flat. The land made obedient. A man behind the desk wears a clean collar. His hands are soft, which tells you what kind of work he does. He's not the owner. He's not the cowboy. He's something more American than either. An agent, a translator. He speaks in terms that turn sky into payments. He points to the map with a pencil. Here's your section line. Here's your water. Here's the rail. Close enough to matter. He doesn't say what's missing from the picture. The years of fence crews bleeding on wire, the windmills turning above wells, the line riders freezing in the dark to keep cattle from drifting into trouble. He doesn't say that the ranch was once held together by 781 miles of fence by 1886, because that fact isn't helpful to the sale unless it can be turned into reassurance. Improved property, they'd call it. Developed range. Words that make hardship sound like value. The buyer asks the question that's really a plea. How much? And now we're in the heart of it. Not myth, not romance terms. The agent doesn't talk in oceans of acres. He breaks the land down into a size a poor man can imagine. A section, 640 acres, neat as a checkerboard square. A quarter section, 160 acres, the standard bite of ground a family might dare to try. A number small enough to dream over and still large enough to ruin you if the rain doesn't come. The agent slides a paper across the desk. The pen is there, already uncapped, because this is not a conversation. It's a process. The buyer reads slowly. The language is flat and final. Down payment, installments, interest, deadlines, clauses for default. A man can lose land in the same silent way he can lose a house, one missed payment at a time. Outside, the wind pushes dust along the street in low sheets. A sign creaks. A horse stamps in the cold. Inside, the buyer's wife watches the agent's mouth as if his words are a forecast. When the buyer signs, it is not triumph. It is surrender to a hope he can't afford not to have. This is what the XIT becomes in the land sale era. Not a ranch, but a funnel. People pour in. Farmers, small cattlemen, speculators with cash and sharp eyes. And the old kingdom is sliced into pieces, small enough to swallow. The land that once existed as a single corporate fact spread across 10 Panhandle counties begins to fracture into individual fates. You can see it on the ground if you ride long enough. New fences appear, cheaper, uneven, built by men who learned fencing the hard way and fast. A sod house rises like a rough hillock, where yesterday there was only grass. A line of planted trees tries to stand up to the wind and fails, then tries again. Plowed strips cut the prairie skin open, dark and raw, laid out in stubborn rows. The land that once fed cattle now gets asked to feed people. And the ranch, what's left of it, keeps shedding. The old line camps feel quieter. A bunkhouse that once held a dozen men now holds half that. A cook makes biscuits for fewer mouths and watches the doorway as if waiting for the past to come back in. A cowboy rides a fence line that used to mark power and now marks retreat. He passes survey stakes fresh in the ground, new corners, new claims, and he feels the country turning away from him like a face. By the time you reach November 3rd, 1912, the ranching phase is ready to be put down, clean and public. The last great cattle sale happens the way these things always happen in America, with a hammer, a ledger, and a crowd that knows exactly what it's watching, even if nobody says it out loud. The air is cold. Breath rises off the animals. Men lift bids with small motions of the hand, like they're ashamed to be seen wanting. Lots move through the ring. The brand that once signaled an empire becomes just another mark in a market full of marks. Afterward, the pens are emptier than they've ever been. The sound changes. A place that used to roar now echoes, and yet the land remains vast, patient, indifferent, being sold off piece by piece, deed by deed, until the original shape is only a memory in old maps and older mouths. The public thinks it's watching an ending. The syndicate thinks it's watching a conversion. Because here's the part that matters, and the part most people miss. Selling the surface is not the same thing as selling the wealth. A man can buy dirt and still never own what sleeps beneath it. So when the XIT broke itself into 160-acre dreams and 640-acre bargains, when it let go of cattle and let go of grass, what did it keep? Quietly, legally, and forever. Under the paper-thin surface of all that sold land, they tell you the ranch was sold off, and that was that. That the last cattle went through the ring on November 1st, 1912. And the great kingdom exhaled and disappeared into the ordinary world. Fields, towns, fences that weren't famous, lives that weren't written down. They tell it like an ending, like a man shutting a gate and walking away. But an empire doesn't really end if it keeps its hands in your soil, because there was a trick in the paperwork, quiet enough that a tired farmer signing by lamplight might not feel it until decades later. The trick was simple and perfectly American. You could sell the surface and keep what mattered underneath. Out on the plains, ownership feels like what your boots stand on. Your fence, your well, your windbreak, your little square of earth you can measure in 160 acres if you're poor, or 640 acres if you're bold enough to say the word section without laughing. You buy it. You pay on it. You work it until your hands change shape. But in a back room with a desk and a stamp and a deed book, ownership is something else entirely. Ownership is language. Picture the office where the parcels are being carved out. Early 20th century, after 1901, when the first real land sales begin. And after 1912, when the cattle are gone and the romance has been boxed up for future use. There's a stove in the corner, and the stove makes the room too warm. And that warmth mixes with the smell of ink and wool and sweat-dried paper. Maps hang on the wall. The ranch flattened, squared, civilized. A clerk sits with a stack of deeds and a pen that leaves a fat, certain line. Across from him is a buyer, a man whose hands are cracked and stained from work that doesn't stop. He has dust in the creases of his knuckles like it lives there. His wife sits beside him, quiet, watching the clerk's mouth. The baby sleeps in her arms. The baby's cheeks are red from wind. The buyer thinks this is a land transaction. He thinks he's buying the whole earth he can see. The clerk slides the deed across and points to the signature line. The buyer leans in. He reads the description. township, range, section, quarter section, the sacred geometry of American settlement. He sees the acreage. He sees the price and the terms. He swallows, because swallowing is what men do when they sign away years of their lives in exchange for a chance. And then, in the middle of the page, in a paragraph that looks like every other paragraph, there it is, a reservation clause, cold and unromantic. Something like, reserving all oil, gas, and other minerals in, on, and under said land. The buyer's eyes slide over it, not because he's stupid, because he's exhausted, because his mind is fixed on rain and debt and getting a roof up before the next hard winter, because minerals sounds like a distant idea, like buried treasure in a children's book, nice to imagine, not something you plan your life around. He is here for dirt and grass. He signs for dirt and grass. The clerk's pen scratches. The seal comes down with a dull thump. A page is filed. A receipt is written into the future. And that is the long con, if you want to call it that. Not a gunman in the dark. Not a poker game. A sentence in legal language that survives longer than any cowboy ever did. Because what the syndicate and its successors understood, what men in cities have always understood better than men on the land, is that the surface is where you suffer, but the subsurface is where you get paid. A ranch like the XIT began as a land transaction wearing the skin of a cattle story. 3,000 acres traded away by the state for a capital that would stand and shine and make people feel permanent. The cattle phase, the part with dust and brands and riders, was real, but it was also temporary. Cattle are liquid, they move, they die, they're market-dependent, and markets have moods. The ground is different. The ground just waits. So you sell the surface in pieces that poor men can afford to dream about. You sell it in 160-acre hopes and 640-acre gambles, and you let those new owners fight the wind and the drought and the mortgage schedule. And you keep the mineral estate, because the mineral estate in many places is the dominant estate. It doesn't ask permission. It doesn't care that a family planted cottonwoods by the draw. When the time comes, the mineral owner has rights. Rights that can put a drilling rig in a pasture and a road through a wheat field. All perfectly legal, all perfectly indifferent. Years go by. A generation goes by. The first buyer gets old. His boy takes over. The boy marries. There are new fences, new barns, a graveyard on a rise where the ground is too hard to dig deep. The family learns the moods of the sky. They learn the smell of rain before it falls. They learn how to live with the land's refusal. And then one day, a stranger comes up the lane in a car that looks too clean for this country. He parks by the house. He takes off his hat, polite as a banker, and he says he represents a company. He has a folder in his hand. He's there about a lease. The farmer says, "Lease for what?" The man smiles a little like he's done this before. He says, "Oil, gas, something beneath you." The farmer feels a little lift in his chest, a sudden warmth, the kind of hope that makes a man's hand shake. And then the man points to the deed. He points to the clause. He explains calmly, professionally, that the mineral rights were reserved, that the farmer owns the surface, that he'll be compensated for damages and access, sure, within reason. But the wealth beneath his feet is not his. It belongs to a name on paper that may have changed hands a dozen times since the old ranch was cut up. Trusts, successor companies, heirs, holding entities, whatever form the original bargain has shed itself into. The face changes. the hand remains. The farmer stands there and looks at his field the way you look at a friend you didn't realize had been lying to you for 30 years. He looks at the draw where his children played. He looks at the pasture where his father's cattle grazed. He tries to reconcile the life he lived with a sentence he didn't read. And the man in the clean car keeps talking, royalties, bonuses, production, words that sparkle and vanish. The farmer hears them as a kind of insult, not because money is bad, because the money is being offered to someone else. This is what the XIT becomes after it ends. A ghost with a legal claim, an invisible landlord beneath the soil, a story that keeps collecting rent long after the cowboys are gone, long after the brand has turned into nostalgia. And it's all so clean, so lawful, so perfectly filed. Which leaves one more kind of reckoning, the kind that doesn't come from markets or drought or settlers with wire cutters, but from the state itself finally looking back at the original deal and asking whether the ranch got exactly what it was promised, or whether the first measurements were fat with mistakes that only ever seemed to favor the men holding the paper. They'll tell you the state got what it bargained for. 3 million acres for a capital, clean exchange, end of story. Texas paid in grass and got its granite, and everybody walked away satisfied, like a deal struck under a fair sky. But the truth is, the deal kept moving after the photograph stopped. Because land is never just land. Land is measurement. And measurement is where men learn to lie without raising their voices. In 1918, long after the last great cattle drives had already faded into memory, and long after the Capitol's dome had settled into the skyline like it had always been there, Texas finally turned back toward the Panhandle with a cold kind of curiosity. Not romance, not pride, suspicion. There is a room in Austin, some government office with tall windows and a ceiling fan that turns slow, pushing hot air in circles that don't cool anything. Papers stacked in uneven towers. A map rolled open on a table, its edges curled like dried leaves. A man in a suit leans over it with his tie loosened and his collar darkened where sweat has soaked in. He's not thinking about cowboys. He's thinking about numbers. He's thinking about an old promise, 3,000 acres. And he's thinking about the uneasy realization that the promise may have been delivered the way so many promises are delivered in America, generously, but only in one direction. The complaint is simple enough that it almost sounds harmless when you say it aloud. The surveys ran fat. The lines drifted. The corners fell where they should not have fallen, not by much, they'd argue, only by 2 to 4%. A small error, the way a small leak in a dam is small right up until the moment it empties the lake. But on 3 million acres, 2% is not a rounding mistake. It is a kingdom. The state's lawyers put it into a number that can walk into a courtroom without being laughed out. 140.5 acres. That was the alleged excess. More than some counties ever offered a single man. More land than most human beings will ever see in one lifetime, much less own. 57,000 acres, slipped into the syndicate's hands under the cover of compass needles and chain sag, and close enough. You can picture the first filing the way these things always begin, not with drama, but with a pen, ink drawn across paper, a clerk stamping a date, a document folded and carried like a quiet weapon, and then service. Some representative of the old capital interests receives the papers. Maybe it's a man sitting in a plain office. Maybe it's an agent working for the trust that had been formed back in 1915. A new corporate skin to hold what remained of the old ranch's property while the land continued to be sold off in pieces. The Farwell Estate's machinery still turning, maps still pinned, deeds still recorded, mineral reservations still written in sentences most people didn't read. He opens the envelope. He reads the words. He doesn't panic. Men in that world rarely panic. They calculate. Because the state's accusation isn't just about acres. It's about legitimacy. It's about whether a public bargain made in desperation after November 9th, 1881, when the old Capitol burned, had been honored in spirit or only in loopholes. It's about whether the same machinery that could raise $3,124,545 to build a Capitol as part of a total cost of $3,700 had also been clever enough to collect a little extra on the side, the way powerful entities always seem to do when the frontier is far away and oversight is thin. So the response is drafted. Calm. Technical. The kind of language that kills anger by starving it of oxygen. They will say the surveys were made in good faith. They will say errors are inevitable in a country that's flat and vast. They will say the work was done by professionals. They will say the state accepted the land and benefited from it and cannot now, decades later, pretend it was cheated. And meanwhile, out in the Panhandle, the land does what it always does while men argue. It endures. A survey crew goes back to old corners because courts don't care what you feel. Courts care what you can prove. A man rides out with a notebook and a chain. He finds a worn stake, half-rotted, leaning. He finds a pile of stones arranged by hands that are long dead. He stands there and looks across miles of grass that have been grazed and fenced and sold and plowed and resold, and he tries to imagine the moment when someone first decided that this point on earth would become law. The wind still comes steady from the west. It rattles the wire. It slides through the grass like a hand smoothing hair, and it makes the whole idea of exact feel ridiculous. But exact is what the court demands. So the state presses, and the syndicate, whatever form it has taken by then, presses back. Not with guns, with survey notes, with affidavits, with men sworn to remember measurements made when they were younger and the world was less settled. In the end, Texas doesn't claw back everything it claims. It claws back something that can be written cleanly into a judgment. 27,613.6 acres recovered in Dallam County, 30,226.9 acres recovered in Hartley County. Together the numbers add up like a stern little sermon. Yes, the surveys exceeded the stipulated areas, and yes, the state was right to say so, at least in part. The empire's geometry had been padded. The bargain had been sweetened. The public had been, in a small but meaningful way, shorted. But look at the timing. Look at the shape of the victory. By 1918, the ranching phase had already bled out. The last cattle had been sold back in 1912. The land was already being carved and sold into 160-acre hopes, section by section. The machinery that mattered, the legal machinery, had already adapted. It had already learned to shed skin. Recovering acreage then was like snatching a few boards from a house that had already been sold room by room. You can win in court and still lose the larger war. You can retrieve tens of thousands of acres and still not touch the deeper wealth, the mineral clauses, the trusts, the quiet right to profit long after the cowboys are gone. A state can prove it was cheated and still find itself playing a game whose rules were written by the same men who benefited from the first mistake, and that is the bitter taste of it. The lawsuit is not a cleansing, it's an acknowledgment, a public admission that the myth of fair dealing was always a little too clean for a country built on distance and paperwork. So when Texas finally looks back at the bargain and finds the measurements don't match the promise, when it recovers 57 out of 40.5 acres worth of truth in 2 hard county totals, what does that really say about the nation that made the deal in the first place? And the nation we became by living with it. They'll tell you the West is a place where things end clean. A man rides off, a ranch goes under, the wind wipes the tracks, the story closes like a gate. But the truth is, the West doesn't end. It just changes owners. It changes names. It changes the language on the paperwork. And the people who live inside the change, those are the ones the myth forgets, because the myth needs a hero. The myth needs a villain. The myth needs a clean line you can draw with your finger and say, here is where it began, and here is where it finished. It didn't finish. It never does. The XIT started as a bargain dressed in civic pride, 3,000 acres made into a building you can point at, a capital of stone, paid for with grass and distance and the willingness of a government to barter tomorrow for today. The state wanted permanence. The syndicate wanted value. The cowboys wanted wages. The settlers wanted a foothold. And the land, old as anything, wanted nothing at all. People still argue about whether it was a marvel or a scam. That's the word they like now, scam, because it fits the American hunger for moral clarity. If you call it a scam, you can spit and walk away feeling righteous. If you call it a marvel, you can clap and walk away feeling proud. But if you actually look at it, if you look at the machine beneath the story, it's both. It is capability and it is extraction. It is vision and it is appetite. It is men building something that worked and men getting rich off work done by hands that never got their names on the deed. The XIT's greatness was not the cowboy, not the brand, not the endless horizon. It was the system. It was fence miles and well depths and payroll sheets. It was the ability to turn a place into an instrument. To take a landscape that did not belong to paperwork and make it behave as if it did. To take the old idea of public land and transform it into private leverage. To take a state's desperation after fire and pride and turn it into a long-running return. And you can admire that capability while still feeling your stomach turn at the cost. Because for all the talk of great men, none of it happened without the invisible workforce. The cooks, the fence crews, the clerks, the line riders, the men who climbed windmill towers in winter wind, hands numb on metal, trying to keep water flowing. The men who rode out into storms to gather scattered cattle and came back with eyes burned raw from sleet. The settlers who took on debt for 160 acres and lived inside that debt until it became their religion. The families who buried children in hard ground because the doctor was too far and the money was too thin. These people built the real capital even if they never saw it. And then there's the deeper lesson, the one that doesn't live in the dust, but in the documents. That America is not only a story of conquest by force. It is conquest by paperwork, by clauses, by reserved rights, by measurements that drift 2 or 4% in the direction they're encouraged to drift. The state eventually looked back and found the math didn't match the promise. It sued. It recovered acreage in court. It proved on paper that the deal had been padded. But what does that victory mean when the land has already been cut up and sold, when the surface is already in the hands of people who did the work, and the subsurface, quietly, legally, still belongs to the entities that understood the future best. This is the modern world in a nutshell, a place where you can own what you can touch and still not own what makes money beneath your feet. You can call that corruption. You can call it genius. You can call it the natural end of a nation built on contracts as much as courage. But it's hard to call it surprising, because if there is a single American pattern, it's this. We turn what is common into what is owned. We turn what is wild into what is measured. We turn what is public into what is profitable. And then, once the machinery is in motion, we tell ourselves it was destiny, and destiny absolves us of guilt. In the end, the XIT doesn't feel like a story about a ranch. It feels like a story about a country learning what it is. And so we come back to the first image, because endings that matter always return to beginnings. A cold morning in the Panhandle, early November, breath hanging in pale ropes over the backs of cattle, a man with a ledger standing close enough to feel the heat off the herd like a stove door left open. The mud sour and iron-stained at the gate. The smell of coffee scorched on a stove somewhere to the side. The wind moving through the pens as if it is trying to erase the whole scene. A man calls numbers, not prayers. Numbers. And the numbers are the real language of this place, whether we admit it or not. Lot by lot, the cattle go through. The empire reduces itself to inventory. And a crowd watches. Some faces are hard with satisfaction, some with loss, some with the blank look men wear when they don't want anyone to see what they feel. The ledger fills, pages turn, boots scrape. A gate swings shut, and somewhere far away, the Capitol still stands, pink granite holding light like a promise. If you pull back far enough, higher than the sail barn roof, higher than the town, higher than the Panhandle itself, you can see the whole shape of it. Grass to cattle, cattle to cash, cash to stone, stone to pride, pride to myth, myth back to money, and below on the ground, the wind keeps moving. It moves through old fence lines and new ones. It moves over fields where the prairie used to run unbroken. It moves over graves. It moves over deeds filed in county offices. It moves over the quiet rights written into clauses nobody read. The camera keeps pulling back. The pens get small. The people get smaller. The ranch becomes an idea again, a shape in memory, a brand on paper, a story told the way stories like to be told. And you're left with one question that won't go away, because it's the same question America keeps asking and never answering cleanly. When a nation builds its monuments on bargains like this, when it turns land into stone and suffering into profit, what part of the story do you call truth? And what part do you call legacy?